And I can assure you that we will keep our sleeves rolled up. We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. And we know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
This speech, maybe with the exception of the Kennedy speech of going to the moon, this speech gives me goosebumps. This is a Groundhog's Day. I've done this video once before. I don't like that video. And so I'm going to do this video again. This video should only be 15 minutes at the most, not 20-something minutes long. But I do want to make my point more succinct. And I missed the very basic point that I was getting at in the last video. So I'm going to try to do this once more. This should sound familiar to you. They say history doesn't rhyme, but it does repeat. We are in a repeat, right? Ultimately, what FDR is saying there sounds a lot like what Bernie Sanders is saying today. And for the most part, the forces that have been allied against him were so entrenched that he didn't just have to fight the capitalist class. He also had to fight his own party, the Supreme Court. This notion of packing the court came from FDR coming up with ideas of adding more members to the Supreme Court. It was like, oh my God, he's going to pack the court. He's going to pack the court. It must be understood. We look at FDR through our lens, and it makes it look as, because the Democratic Party parrot what FDR says while dropping the context, it makes it look as if the anchors of the party was FDR. FDR was an aberration. He was a blip. Not to mention the war. You had a situation where it came across after he pushed through New Deal politics, where he essentially wrapped the knuckles of the rich in order to fund his social programs, Social Security, Medicare. These programs that for the most part are still there today, and a Democratic Party that still parrots the way he talks. Look back from the moment though at his lens. What was the world looking like for FDR? Around the time that he was alive, he remembers the Russian Revolution. He remembers the potential revolutions and the disquiet that were in Germany. He even remembers, of course, he was around for the Second World War, but he remembers that the origins for that were in the First World War, where he was alive for. His worldview looked differently. The country and the makeup of the country was different. He had communists, he had socialists, he had workers, movements, things, for the most part, that could challenge the power of the Democratic Party. And in real terms, potentially, what he considered a potential for a workers' revolt. Always think back to what FDR said his biggest accomplishment was. He was elected 4 times as a focal point of the proletariat. But his main thing, I saved capitalism. I saved capitalism. Do you believe that there are people today, enlightened capitalists, or that there are enough of enlightened capitalists, I mean, in order to make an approach that way, that will make an opinion like that says, look, I need to do these visionary politics. I need to do these expansive, emancipatory things that would unlock the potential of the lower classes and put money in the hands of the lower classes in order to stem off this various social upheaval that we're experiencing. Do you believe that the classes that are available today, the political class, media class, the oligarchs, do you believe that there's enough enlightened members of that to look over the political landscape and come to similar conclusions? I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that at all. Ultimately, the catch here in my argument is that the Democratic Party and the people who, for the most part, run that party, the Democratic Party and Republican Party are ultimately the same party, just different wings. Both are captured by corporate interests. Both, for the most part, have people who are running those parties that are rich and of a particular class distribution, or at the very least, orients their way around the world for that class perspective. The Russian Revolution was over 100 years ago. The Soviet Union has gone bust. Unions have gone bust. And for the most part, the Democratic Party is captured. Bill Clinton taking the Faustian bargain that I can take all of this cash to be incremental about stuff. Because ultimately, the people in the Democratic Party that made up the Democratic Party, meaning the base itself, had nowhere else to go. Republicans are monsters. What are you going to do? Vote those monsters in? You have nowhere else to go. In which case, incrementalism became the mantra and the singing point for the Democratic Party. And you would accept this incrementalism because the monsters will do worse. Do they believe that they just won? And because they believe that they just won, and all of these other artifacts that were pushing back, they give this impression and this notion of workers. Ultimately, you had two classes, or one class, that captured both parties. And the range of debate had so narrowed that the notion of class and class arguments were pushed to the wayside. Why would two parties that are run by corporate interests, where you have media that is organized around corporate interests, that you have politicians for the most part that are also rich and look at the world through this class lens, why would they need to talk about class when that only adversely affects their interests? We don't have that elite or that enlightened plutocrats that can make certain perspectives like this that would head off the fascists or head off upheaval. What happened in 2008? Ultimately, Obama gets in, he recognizes that we're at a moment of change. We're at a moment where the public is frenetic for something different. And he runs a campaign of uber momentum, screaming into a mic, hope and change, hope and change. And what does it mean to you? What does it mean to you? That expansive rhetoric. And he gets in office and gives 95% of the income gains to the top 1%, and he puts Wall Street in charge of Wall Street. Think about that. When I ask you, is the Democratic Party more likely to ignore what is going on from the standpoint of a rumbling within the public itself, even when it acknowledges from the run that Obama did, the hope and change thing, that is very specific political casting for an audience that wants something fundamentally different. They gave him a mandate, a supermajority in the Senate, the House. And what does he do? 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. 2016 comes around. The public is still frenetic for change. And the guy who represents that change, Sanders, who nobody knew, who started off with 3% in the tally, spikes. He catches on fire. And catches on fire to such an extent that the Democratic Party cheated him. A guy who called himself a socialist was running against the most established candidate who they considered to be inevitable. And the party still cheated him. He still ended up getting 46% of the vote share, meaning from the standpoint of the delegates. And despite this, Hillary Clinton runs a tone-deaf campaign, and the change candidate in that race, Donald Trump, wins. Why? The public wanted something fundamentally different. They've been screaming for that hope and change that they never got since Obama. And Clinton runs a tone-deaf campaign that they believe that the public is just going to coordinate her for, with the exception of her just winning the race. When I make the point that they will choose Trump over Sanders, I'm doing so because in the past, they've done just that. Meaning the Hillary Clinton race, for example, was one of those scenarios. You can make the case, well, maybe they didn't realize that the public would reject Clinton in this way. Okay, but what about now? What about now? Ultimately, many people, most people would accept that they believe that Bernie Sanders would have won in 2016. And you have Sanders running again. He has money. He has, he's blowing out stadiums. He's surging to like first and second. And what is the reaction of the Democratic Party? Full freak out. It's not that they think he's going to lose. It's more so that they actually think he's going to win if he did run against Trump and made it through the primaries. All of the superdelegates come into play, all of the media, this notion of them pretending that he doesn't exist. And even now, billionaires are getting into the race, and they're throwing more bodies into the race, despite having a clown car of 22 people already into the race. You must understand, this is an issue of class. From the standpoint of the Democratic Party, yes, the people on the ground despise Trump. The political class may also despise Trump. But you must understand what Sanders means. He is an existential threat in literal and real terms. The fact that FDR existed gets across this point that FDR or somebody like him can exist again depending on the environmental factors that come up and become available. Well, those environmental factors are rearing their heads. And at this point, Sanders is not running in this race with this notion that he is just pushing to the left. He's running in this race with the notion of winning. He knows that the public is on board for this. He knows that his plans are popular. He knows that he has a funding mechanism that would take him from point A to point B. And he also knows that when he gets up in the morning and goes to bed at night, that he full well believes in what he's saying. He's a true believer. The catch is the other party knows it, meaning the Democratic Party also knows that. Tell me something. The Democratic Party are full of just plutocrats. When you're getting into the established party, you're just talking about people of a particular class. They may dislike Trump, but what does it mean for that class if Sanders wins? And yes, in a political space, they may ballyhoo and everything else, but what does it mean from the standpoint of their class if Sanders wins or if Trump wins? From the standpoint of the Democratic Party itself, if Sanders wins, ultimately, for the last 40 years, the propaganda that has said this was utterly impossible is shown for the sham that it is. If Sanders wins, and he is now a Democrat, then what the hell are they? Discredited. That's what they are. Meaning the very fact of him being able to win gets across that somebody like him could have won potentially prior. And that all of the propaganda that said this was impossible, you can't raise money in this way, you can't run a campaign in this way, you can't talk about these issues, all gets shown to be a sham. A tool of propaganda in order to legitimize their incrementalist platform and the money that they were taking. They don't want to discredit themselves with this notion of Sanders winning. If Sanders loses to Trump, even that is more beneficial because at that point you could turn around and say for a generation, you went too far to the left. You went too far to the left. We told you went too far to the left. And this, of course, is coming from people who lost the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, and 1,100 seats throughout the United States. But they will, with a straight face, tell you that you went too far to the left. If Sanders wins and is successful, what does that mean for the legacy of Obama? We're talking about healthcare still to this day after Obamacare being put into place, which is tantamount to Obamacare being somewhat of a failure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about healthcare to this day. If you are able to push through a Medicare for all plan, what does it mean from the standpoint of the guy who screamed hope and change, had a supermajority in the Senate and had the House? And what does it mean for the policies that the Democratic Party has been putting forward for the last 40 years? My point is, the existence of a Sanders in and of itself is serving to just the very notion of what it means to be a Democrat because he exposes them for what they are. He clearly is representing the workers' interests. It makes it that much more clear that they're not. I hope you understand what I mean. From the standpoint of the oligarchs that run this party, they consider him, again, also an existential threat. If you have capital capture of both of the parties, and all of a sudden this guy is not taking your money, he's antagonistic to your interests, and he is popular and could potentially win. I mean, understand, Elizabeth Warren is in this race right now. She is gutting into his numbers. If she wasn't in the race, those people would most likely be with Sanders, meaning Biden is only winning by virtue of who is in the race. And you can make an argument, yeah, that's true. He's only winning by virtue of who's in the race. Warren is taking the steam out of Sanders by aping Sanders. The predominance of the vote share is between Warren and Sanders, between Sanders himself, who calls himself a socialist, and between Warren, who's pretending to be him. I hope you understand what I mean. In regards to him being able to win, it's there. He has the potential to win. They, just like in 2008, just like in 2016, they're still throwing bodies into the race to try to find something to stop him from winning, even at risk of putting somebody in the race like Biden, who will get beat up in those debates, or Warren, who they don't even believe can win. Their interest is served by Trump winning as opposed to Sanders. That's my point. And they will be willing. This is an issue of class. This is less to do with politics. It is an issue of class. The people at the top of the Democratic Party, from a class standpoint, are not hurt or touched by Trump winning at all. They are materially hurt by Sanders winning. From the standpoint of the image of the party, meaning that image of the party has now taken the demeanor of Sanders. And those people who were in that party that kept telling you for all of these years that what he's talking about is utterly impossible, get put to the corner, shown up for the frauds that they were. If he is successful, then it shows you the potential was available. They just didn't go that route. And for a generation, just like FDR, it enshrines this narrative and this notion of what it means to be a Democrat, a hegemonic norm. It instantiates various programs, just like Social Security and Medicare, that at this point are considered so normal that it would be, people would be apoplectic if you tried to rip those programs away. In 10 years, Medicare for all would be the same. Expansion of Social Security would be the same. Free college would be the same. Those things would be considered normal from the context of our society, and it would be difficult, if not impossible, to rip those things away in short order. They are terrified of him. From their standpoint, particularly Democrats, they look at him as an existential threat. And for third-way Democrats, he is. If he's a Democrat, then what the hell are you? And what the hell have you been doing over the past, at the tenor when you've been having power? And from the standpoint of the oligarchs, they lose control of one of the political parties that they have had access to for the last 40 years. This is about class. Yes, there's a politics to it, but this is mostly about class. And from a class standpoint, they are hurt by Sanders. First point. From a politics standpoint or party standpoint, they are hurt by Sanders. The fact that he takes these positions, if he can hold those positions and if he can win those positions, then that is an outright rebuke of what it means to be a third-way Democrat and the established norm of the Democratic Party. Not to mention the ability for oligarchs to pull the strings of the party are decapitated in one blow. All of these forces have allied against Sanders in the way that Sanders has been pushing his politics. And that is part and parcel for the reason why. When FDR is making this argument, FDR had to fight his own party, he had to fight the oligarchs that were entrenched. He even had to push back against the Supreme Court because of how entrenched the policies and rules and laws were. That would be no different for Sanders. You have dollars or you have pitchforks. In this case, he is trying to rival or bring up the pitchforks to fight his own party, to fight to establish order in regards to the economic might and the capitalistic might in the country. Even from the standpoint of media, he is taking all of these things on. He has still been able to push forward the guy who they said was impossible, and yet have been rallying in order to go against. I'll leave it here. I just want to make the very specific point that we look at this through our lens, meaning from the population itself. And we say, oh God, Democrats hate him. Yeah, Democrats do hate Donald Trump. But you have to ask, what does it mean to be a Democrat if Sanders wins, especially the order of Democrats that have had power all this time, the 20 Democrats that are in the race that are doing everything that they can to stop him? What does it mean to be a Democrat when he, the actual left, takes over? What does the DNC look like when he sets the head of that organization and the organization changes and conforms to what he wants? What does it mean when a generation of Democrats get into office thinking in his context, in his brand of politics? What does it mean from the standpoint of a Republican Party that has to deal with that? Does the party ends up being dragged to the left, or does it have an outright rebuke of what Sanders is trying to do? And how long does that rebuke last if he becomes popular and they actually start to win in a more consistent way? What does it mean for the oligarchs in this country when their wealth gets taxed? When those programs start to roll out that benefits the majority of the population? What do those things mean? And the oligarchs, who for the most part work with the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party that has a worldview that essentially works in line with the oligarchs, both of these parties are going to be harmed. And again, this is the upper establishment of it. This is an issue of class. And I want to make the point to you that regardless of the ballyhooing about Trump, if it comes down between Trump and Sanders, they will choose Trump. Mark my words. They will choose Trump. Nancy Pelosi has $100 million in the bank. All of these people are fantastically wealthy. They may hate Trump, but I don't think you have enough conscious capitalists, either in the Democratic Party or that is funding the Democratic Party, that would be okay with Sanders winning. He really, in real terms, is an existential threat to them. Pop reality, thanks, man. Pop reality, Bernie needs an antidote for this scenario. I got to be honest, I don't know the antidote. I was thinking of this in terms of Bolivia. The capitalist class is working with the fascists in order to topple that government. The U.S. wants to get his hand on those resources and for the most part has co-signed this toppling of the government, trying to invalidate the election results that were, the election was right, the election was fair. I think to myself, will they do the same thing in the United States if Sanders gets involved? They've had power for the last 40 years. They've captured both parties and were able to set the range of debate between those parties for things that for the most part excluded class and dealt more with identity, where you could essentially break the population up in these various groups. They've argued identity in this country but the last multiple years with this notion that we're not racist and we're a tick to the left of the Republican Party. We're least worse. So vote for us. That least worse argument has started to fall apart and hit the skids. Hillary Clinton runs and believes that people should just coordinate her with the election, missing the point that people, even going back to Obama, wanted something fundamentally different. Obama just tricked them. Clinton couldn't pull it off. Trump gets in office and everybody freaks out. And they're like, we don't understand how Trump gets in office. Trump got in office entirely for environmental factors, meaning your failures. Sanders was widely believed to have beaten Trump if he ran. And in this race, the Democratic Party would do everything that they can to stop the person with all the energy that's blowing out stadiums, that is raising more money than the other people in the race. They will do everything that they can in their power to stop him, despite the fact that from the standpoint of who is your best horse to beat it, that's the guy. That doesn't matter. That's less important. For the elites in the party, he is an existential threat, either from the standpoint of destroying any notion of what it means to be a Democrat from their perspective, destroying their power base in the party itself, and also gutting this notion of the oligarchs having control of one of the major parties. In one fell swoop, they're terrified that they're going to lose. In their mind, Trump is a better option. That's my point. Pop reality burned with high-vis celebrities to campaign for him during the impeachment and announced his VP as Nina Turner. I wouldn't mind Miss Turner. Miss Turner is awesome, but it's possible that Miss Turner is better at the helm of an army going after his opponents, meaning she's out there head of the, Our Revolution organization. She may be better off at the helm of that organization, but I would have no issue with her being VP. Love me some Miss Nina Turner. Like, share, subscribe.